My beloved child. Stop scrolling for a moment, because what you are about to hear is a fictional spiritual message created for entertainment and inspiration, but let your heart enter the story as though heaven has opened a quiet door just for you. Something has shifted in the unseen world of this story. Someone who thought you would always be there has suddenly realized that you may not wait forever. And the moment that realization reached them, everything changed. They panicked. Not because they suddenly discovered that you were leaving a place. Not because they heard someone else was coming into your life. They panicked because, for the first time, they understood something they had been refusing to understand for a very long time. You were actually capable of walking away. You were capable of choosing yourself. You were capable of closing the door they assumed would remain open. And my beloved child, that realization struck them harder than any argument ever could. Pause here for a moment. Think about the person who has been living inside the emotional story of this message. Imagine them somewhere tonight, sitting quietly, staring at a phone they have picked up and put down more times than they can count. Imagine the room around them becoming strangely silent while their mind repeats one sentence again and again. What if they really leave this time? That question frightened them. Because they had become comfortable with your presence without truly honoring it. They had become accustomed to your patience. They had mistaken your silence for permission. They had mistaken your love for an unlimited supply. They had watched you forgive things that should have been discussed. They had watched you remain gentle when you had every reason to become distant. They had watched you step back instead of demanding answers. And somewhere deep inside, they created a dangerous assumption. They assumed you would always come back. They assumed time was on their side. They assumed there would always be another conversation. Another chance. Another message. Another tomorrow. But something happened. You changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. You did not announce your transformation to the world. You simply reached a point inside yourself where your heart became tired of begging for what should have been freely given. And that quiet transformation was the thing they never saw coming. For so long, they were watching your actions. They were watching whether you texted. Whether you called. Whether you checked on them. Whether you responded quickly. Whether you still cared. But they were not watching the invisible movement happening inside your heart. They did not realize that every unanswered question was teaching you something. Every delayed response was teaching you something. Every moment you had to pretend you were okay was teaching you something. Every time you swallowed your feelings to preserve the connection was teaching you something. And eventually, you learned the lesson they never expected you to learn. Love does not mean abandoning yourself. That was the turning point. And somehow, in this fictional spiritual story, they sensed it before you ever said a word. They felt the difference. Your energy was no longer reaching toward them in the same desperate way. Your silence felt different. Your absence felt different. Even when you were physically present, something about you had become unreachable. And that scared them. Because they had always believed they understood you. They thought they knew how long you would wait. They thought they knew what would make you stay. They thought they knew how deeply you cared. But suddenly, they discovered that they had misunderstood the most important thing of all. Your love was deep. But your love was not a prison. And now they were standing at the edge of a possibility they never wanted to face. You might actually leave. Not to punish them. Not to make them jealous. Not to make them chase you. But because you had finally realized that your peace mattered too. And this is where the story becomes more intense. Because they did not learn this from you directly. They learned it indirectly. Someone said something. Something small. Something almost ordinary. A sentence that seemed meaningless at first. But it landed inside them like thunder. They heard that you were making changes. They heard that you were thinking differently. They heard that you were becoming more independent. They heard that you were no longer waiting for the same things you once waited for. And then someone mentioned something that made their entire expression change. They heard that you were preparing to leave. Maybe it was a physical departure in the story. Maybe you were preparing to leave a situation, a place, a chapter, or an emotional pattern. But whatever form it took, the meaning was the same. You were moving forward. Without them. For a few seconds, they did not know what to say. They tried to laugh. They tried to pretend it did not matter. They tried to convince themselves that you would change your mind. But then came the thought they could not silence. What if this time they mean it? And suddenly, all the memories they had buried began rising. They remembered your patience. They remembered your eyes. They remembered the conversations they never finished. They remembered the messages they never answered properly. They remembered the moments when you needed reassurance and they gave you silence. They remembered how many times you tried to explain what you felt. And they remembered the moment when you finally stopped explaining. That memory hurt the most. Because they realized your silence had not meant you had nothing to say. Your silence had meant you had said enough. And that was when panic began. They reached for their phone. They opened your conversation. They stared at your name. They typed something. Deleted it. Typed again. Deleted it again. They wanted to ask where you were going. But they were afraid of the answer. They wanted to ask whether you still loved them. But they were terrified that you might say no. They wanted to ask whether there was someone else. But deep down, they knew that was not the real question. The real question was much more painful. Have I lost my place in their heart? And my beloved child, that question forced them to confront something they had avoided for too long. They had been treating your love as though it were guaranteed. Now they were discovering that love can be real and still have boundaries. They were discovering that someone can love you deeply and still walk away from confusion. Someone can miss you and still choose peace. Someone can forgive you and still refuse to repeat the same cycle. That realization shook them. Because they had expected you to remain emotionally available no matter how uncertain they became. But now they could feel a door closing. Not violently. Not angrily. Quietly. And sometimes a quiet door closing is more powerful than 1,000 slammed doors. They remembered the way you used to look at them. There was warmth there. There was hope. There was a kind of innocence. You believed the story would eventually make sense. You believed there would eventually be a moment when they would stop running from their feelings and finally tell you the truth. But time passed. And hope without movement slowly becomes exhaustion. That is what they did not understand. They thought your patience meant you were comfortable. They did not know your patience was costing you. They thought your silence meant you did not care. They did not know your silence was the last form of self-protection you had left. They thought your distance was temporary. They did not realize that distance had become your healing. And when they finally understood that, their heart dropped. Because suddenly, the possibility of losing you was no longer imaginary. It was becoming real. They began replaying the smallest details. A message from months ago. A conversation they had dismissed. A look you gave them. A moment when you seemed disappointed but said nothing. A time when you waited for them and they never came. A moment when they could have told you how they felt but chose pride instead. A moment when they almost reached for you but stopped themselves. They remembered all of it. And now every memory carried a different meaning. That is how regret works in this story. It does not arrive all at once. It arrives through details. A song. A photograph. A familiar place. A name. A notification. A sentence someone says. And suddenly, the person you thought you had forgotten becomes the person you cannot stop thinking about. That night, they could not sleep. They turned off the light. Closed their eyes. Opened them again. They tried to distract themselves. It did not work. They tried to convince themselves that you would return. Their heart rejected the lie. They told themselves, they still care. Then another voice inside them whispered, but what if they have learned not to wait? They turned over. They checked their phone. Nothing. They placed it beside them. A few minutes later, they picked it up again. Still nothing. And that silence became louder than any conversation. Because for the first time, they were not waiting for your message because they were bored. They were waiting because they were afraid. Afraid that your silence was no longer temporary. Afraid that your life was moving beyond the space they occupied. Afraid that while they were still trying to understand what they felt, you had already understood what you needed. And then something even deeper happened. They began imagining your life without them. They imagined you waking up one morning and feeling peaceful. They imagined you no longer checking whether they had contacted you. They imagined you no longer wondering what they were thinking. They imagined you laughing without secretly wishing they were there. They imagined someone else appreciating the softness they once took for granted. That thought broke something inside them. Because suddenly, they understood the true cost of hesitation. It was not simply losing a relationship. It was losing access to the person they had secretly hoped would always remain available. And now they were wondering whether they had waited too long. This was the moment their pride began to collapse. They had spent so long telling themselves they needed more time. More clarity. More certainty. More courage. But now they realized something terrifying. Time does not stop just because someone is afraid to act. Your life keeps moving. Your heart keeps learning. Your soul keeps changing. And eventually, the person who kept waiting becomes the person who no longer needs an answer. That is where you were heading. And that is where they panicked. They started wondering whether they should finally confess what they had hidden. They wondered whether they should call. They wondered whether they should send a message. They wondered whether they should show up. But then fear stopped them. What if they reject me? What if they have moved on? What if they no longer believe me? What if I finally tell them the truth and they simply say it is too late? That last thought terrified them more than anything. Because they remembered how many opportunities they had been given. And suddenly, those opportunities looked like gifts they had carelessly dropped. They remembered your forgiveness. They remembered your understanding. They remembered your patience. They remembered how you tried to see the best in them even when they were showing you the worst. And now they wondered whether they had mistaken your kindness for weakness. They had not understood that there is a difference between someone who stays because they have no choice and someone who stays because they choose love. You were the second kind. And when that choice disappeared, they finally felt the emptiness. My beloved child, this is the emotional center of this fictional message. Sometimes people do not realize what you mean to them while you are standing beside them. Sometimes your presence becomes so familiar that they stop noticing the miracle of it. They notice you only when the room becomes quiet. They notice your value only when your attention is no longer guaranteed. They notice your warmth only when they feel the coldness of your absence. And that does not mean you should disappear just to be appreciated. It means that your worth was never dependent on whether someone recognized it quickly. Your worth existed before their realization. Your worth exists without their permission. Your worth does not increase because someone finally chooses you. And it does not decrease because someone once failed to see you. But in this story, they are finally seeing. And what they see is painful. They see the person who waited. They see the person who hoped. They see the person who gave. They see the person who eventually became tired. They see the person who began rebuilding their own life. And they realize that the version of you who once waited endlessly may never return. That is the part that makes them panic. They do not simply fear losing you. They fear losing the version of you who loved them without conditions. They fear that when they finally come forward, you will have learned how to love yourself too much to accept half-hearted love. And deep down, they know that would be fair. Still, their heart wants another chance. They begin thinking about the first time they realized there was something different about you. They remember how naturally you entered their thoughts. They remember how your name started appearing in their mind during ordinary moments. They remember wanting to tell you things. Small things. Meaningless things. Funny things. Important things. They remember how strangely comfortable your presence felt. And they wonder why they fought something that felt so natural. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they were carrying wounds from the past. Maybe they did not know how to receive love. Maybe they were afraid that if they admitted how deeply they cared, they would become vulnerable. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. They hesitated. And you waited. Until you stopped. That was the moment everything changed. Because there is a difference between chasing someone and choosing them. You were willing to choose them. You were not willing to chase them forever. And now they finally understand the difference. Their hands shake slightly as they type a message. They stare at the words. They almost send them. Then they stop. They wonder whether they should wait until tomorrow. But tomorrow feels dangerous now. Because every additional day creates another possibility that you move farther away. So they type again. This time, they write what they actually feel. Not the polished version. Not the safe version. Not the version that protects their pride. The honest version. I think I am losing you. They stare at those words. And suddenly their eyes fill with emotion. Because admitting that sentence means admitting something else. They cared. They cared far more than they ever admitted. They had been hiding behind distance. Behind confusion. Behind timing. Behind circumstances. Behind excuses. But beneath all of it was fear. Fear of being rejected. Fear of being vulnerable. Fear of loving someone deeply enough that losing them could hurt. And now they are experiencing the very pain they tried to avoid. They put the phone down. Then pick it up again. They cannot send the message. Not yet. Something inside them tells them that if they are going to come toward you, they cannot come with another half-truth. They have to come with everything. Everything they buried. Everything they denied. Everything they wanted to say. And that realization creates another wave of panic. Because they know the truth they have to confess is bigger than, I miss you. It is bigger than, I made a mistake. It is bigger than, I am sorry. There is something they have never told you. Something they kept hidden because admitting it would change the entire meaning of their behavior. And now, with the possibility of losing you becoming real, they can no longer hide behind silence. They remember one specific moment. A moment you probably never knew mattered so much. It was the moment they realized they loved you. Not liked you. Not admired you. Not felt attracted to you. Loved you. And instead of moving closer, they became afraid. They pulled back. They became confusing. They created distance. They convinced themselves they needed space. They acted as though they were uncertain. But the truth was almost the opposite. They were certain. Too certain. That certainty scared them. Because loving you meant that you could hurt them. And they had built an entire emotional wall to prevent anyone from reaching that deeply. You reached it anyway. And instead of opening the door, they locked it. Now they are standing behind that same door, realizing you may no longer be outside. That is why their panic is so intense. They are not suddenly developing feelings. They are suddenly losing the ability to hide them. There is a difference. And that difference is everything. They begin remembering the things you said that once seemed ordinary. You told them that you did not need perfection. You told them you only needed honesty. You told them that silence was harder for you than truth. You told them you could handle difficult conversations. You simply could not handle being kept in the dark. They remember that. And now they realize they gave you exactly what you said you could not live with. Silence. Uncertainty. Distance. Mixed signals. And perhaps that is why the thought of you leaving hurts so much. Because they know, somewhere inside themselves, that they helped create the very distance they now fear. They are not a victim of your departure. They are confronting the consequences of their hesitation. And yet, this is not a story about punishment. It is a story about awakening. Because sometimes people only understand the weight of a choice after they feel its consequences. And sometimes the greatest awakening happens when someone realizes that the person they assumed would wait has finally chosen to move. That night, they make a decision. They will not sleep until they know what they need to do. They walk across the room. They sit down. They take a deep breath. They open your conversation. Their thumb hovers over the call button. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. They stop. Fear returns. Then they hear a thought inside themselves. If I let fear decide again, I may lose them forever. Their eyes close. And for the first time, they choose courage over comfort. They press call. The phone begins ringing. Once. Twice. 3 times. Their heart pounds. 4 times. 5. They begin wondering whether you will answer. And then. Nothing. The call ends. No answer. They stare at the screen. For a moment, they feel crushed. But then something unexpected happens. Instead of giving up, they begin typing. This time they do not delete it. This time they do not overthink every word. They write. I know I may be too late, but I need you to hear me. They pause. Then they continue. I found out you are really leaving. Their breathing becomes heavier. And I panicked. They stop. Their eyes fill with tears. Because they know the next sentence will expose everything. They type. I panicked because I finally realized that losing you is not something I can pretend I am okay with. They stare at it. Then they add one final sentence. There is something you don't know about why I stayed away. Their finger hovers over send. And this time, they press it. The message leaves. Delivered. They watch the screen. No response. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 5. 10. Nothing. They put the phone down. But now the silence feels different. Because the truth has finally been released. And somewhere in the story, you are standing at the beginning of your own decision. You have not yet seen the message. You have not yet heard the confession. You do not yet know what caused their panic. You only know that something inside you has changed. You feel calmer. Stronger. Less desperate. And strangely, you no longer feel the need to force an answer. That is the transformation. You are no longer asking, will they choose me? You are beginning to ask, is what they offer worthy of the person I have become? That question changes everything. Because once you ask it, you cannot go back to the old version of yourself. You cannot unknow what you have learned. You cannot pretend confusion is enough. You cannot call emotional distance a love language. You cannot keep sacrificing your peace for someone else's uncertainty. And perhaps that is why the story has brought you to this exact moment. Not because you need someone to chase you. Not because you need someone to panic. But because you need to understand that your departure can be real even when your heart still loves. Sometimes leaving is not the opposite of love. Sometimes leaving is the final boundary love places around your own soul. And the person in this story is finally beginning to understand that. They look at the message they sent. Then they whisper to themselves, "I should have told them sooner." They remember another secret. Another moment. Another truth. And suddenly, the first confession they sent feels incomplete. Because there is something much bigger behind it. Something connected to the reason they became distant. Something connected to the person who influenced their decisions. Something connected to a conversation they had recently. A conversation that changed everything. A conversation where someone told them something about you. And that is what they have not told you yet. They were not simply told that you were leaving. They were told why. And the reason they heard was not what they expected. Their face changed when they heard it. Because the person who told them said something that forced them to see you differently. They said that you had not stopped caring. You had simply stopped waiting. Those words followed them everywhere. You had not stopped caring. You had simply stopped waiting. They realized that you were not trying to punish them. You were not playing games. You were not trying to make them jealous. You were exhausted. And somehow, that hurt them more. Because anger would have been easier. If you were angry, they could defend themselves. If you hated them, they could tell themselves the story was over. But you were not angry. You were simply becoming peaceful without them. That was unbearable. Because it meant they could not blame anyone. They had to face themselves. And so they did. They began looking at every choice they had made. Every time they chose silence. Every time they avoided vulnerability. Every time they convinced themselves there would be another opportunity. They realized that the future they kept waiting for was never guaranteed. They assumed tomorrow belonged to them. Now they understood that tomorrow is a gift. And sometimes the person you love can be standing beside you today and be gone from your life tomorrow. Not because they stopped loving you. But because they finally learned that love without clarity can become a place where the heart slowly disappears. Their eyes close. And they whisper your name. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Almost like a prayer. Then they say something they have never allowed themselves to say. I was afraid of how much you mattered. That is the truth. Not every person who runs away is running from you. Sometimes they are running from what they feel when they are near you. Sometimes love exposes wounds they have spent years hiding. Sometimes someone sees your heart and realizes they cannot continue pretending they are unaffected. And instead of stepping forward, they retreat. But retreat does not erase emotion. It only delays the moment when emotion demands honesty. That moment has arrived. And now they are standing at the threshold. You are standing at another. Two people. Two doors. Two choices. One person is learning how to stop waiting. The other is learning how to stop running. And neither of you knows what happens next. But one thing has already changed. The old dynamic is over. The version where you chase and they hide is ending, the version where you wonder and they remain silent is ending. The version where they assume you will always be there is ending. Something new must happen. And it will require truth. Real truth. Not romantic words designed to keep you close. Not promises made in panic. Not emotional confessions followed by the same old behavior. Truth that survives after the fear disappears. That is the real test. Because anyone can panic when they think they are losing someone. The question is what they do after the panic. Do they finally become honest? Do they finally take responsibility? Do they finally show consistency? Or do they simply reach for you because your absence hurts? That distinction will matter. And in this fictional story, something extraordinary is about to happen. The phone lights up again. You finally see their name. For a moment, you do nothing. You simply stare. Your heart recognizes the name. But something inside you is different now. You are not shaking the way you once would have. You are not desperate to know what they want. You are not immediately building a future around one notification. You breathe. You open the message. And the first sentence appears. I know you are leaving. You read it again. Then the next line. I found out today. Your heart becomes still. Then another message arrives. I should have told you this a long time ago. You continue reading. I was never as uncertain about you as I pretended to be. Your eyes pause. The room seems quieter. Then another message appears. I was afraid. Another. Not of you. Another. Of losing control of everything I felt when I was around you. You stop. Because now you understand why the message feels different. This is not a casual conversation. This is not someone checking whether you are still available. They are finally opening the door they locked themselves behind. And then the final message appears. The one that makes your heart stop for a moment. There is one thing I need to tell you before you leave. You stare at the screen. Your finger does not move. Another message begins appearing. The typing indicator comes on. Stops. Comes on again. Stops. They are struggling to say it. And then 3 words appear. I chose you. You stare at them. But before you can understand what those words mean, another message arrives. I chose you a long time ago. Then another. But someone else knew before I was brave enough to admit it. Your breathing changes. Because suddenly, the story takes a turn you never expected. Someone else knew. Someone had been watching. Someone had known about their feelings. Someone had heard the truth before you did. And that person had recently said something that made your soulmate realize they were about to lose you. You scroll. There is one final message. I need to tell you who it was. And that is where the story reaches the edge of its next revelation. Because the person who knew their secret was not who you would expect. And what that person revealed about your soulmate, about the connection, and about the decision they made in your absence is about to change the entire meaning of everything that happened before. But for now, stop. Take a breath. Look at the story from a distance. The person who once assumed you would always wait is finally standing in the place you once stood. They are waiting. They are wondering. They are afraid. And you are no longer the person begging for an answer. You are the person holding the answer. The next message has not been opened yet. The name of the person who exposed their secret has not been revealed. And the truth behind why they really pulled away has not yet been spoken. Because the most important confession is still sitting inside that unfinished message. Their finger is already moving across the screen. They are about to tell you what happened. They are about to reveal who knew. They are about to explain why they ran. And most importantly, they are about to confess what they realized the moment they discovered that you were truly ready to leave. Then the typing indicator appears one more time. And this time, it does not disappear. Something is coming. Something they have carried silently for far too long. Something that could either become the beginning of a completely different chapter or the final truth you needed to finally close the old one. You are holding the phone. They are holding their breath. And between you is one message that has the power to change everything. The screen lights up. The message arrives. And the first words say, "My beloved, before you leave, you need to know what I was never brave enough to tell you." And that is where the next revelation begins.